Hi, everyone. I'm really excited to be here. So, as he said, I'm Sara Cambridge. I'm a researcher on material design. And let me tell you what I'm going to be talking about over the next half hour. Hopefully, there'll be some time for Q&A at the end. So first, I'm going to tell you a little bit about material design. You just heard a little bit about it, but I'm going to tell you how we think of material design and what we're working towards. Then I'm going to tell you about some of the research I've done with designers and developers just like you that have given us insight into the products and the patterns that I've uncovered into what makes for more and less effective around designer-developer collaboration. And then I'm going to talk about some best practices for effective teams working together well, and also end with some tips for improving your relationship with your designer-developer colleague. So first, material design. I'd like to see a show of hands for people who have been on material design in the last couple years for either looking at design guidance or some of the UI code documentation. Can I see a show of hands, people who have been on the material design website? OK, it looks like maybe half or a third of you. And who has heard of material design but never actually been to the website? OK, a few of you as well. OK, so most of you know about material design. Well, let me tell you how we think of material design. It's an open source library that is helping people like you, designers and developers, build beautiful, usable products faster. That is our goal. And so there's a few pieces that go into making this. First is the design guidance. So it's the patterns and the information guidance that we've created to help you not have to reinvent the wheel when you think about things like account switchers or any number of things. And the second piece is the code. So it's a library of UI components, things like text fields and buttons. And what we've recently launched at I/O, Google's developer conference, is May, is our new process is material theming. So this allows you to take those UI elements and customize them for your own brand. Another thing that we're really excited about that launched at I/O is our new suite of tools and products to help improve designer-developer collaboration. So this is Gallery. It is a cloud-based tool that lets designers upload directly from Sketch their designs, share them with collaborators, get feedback, and it even delivers design specification data to the developers. So this is our latest effort to improve designer-developer collaboration specifically. So all this stuff lives on Material.io. So it's our website that we've created as a hub for all design, development, and tools. So now let me tell you a little bit about the research. So I've been on material design for 2 years, and Gallery was the first product I was brought on to do research for, and now I do research for that kind of whole ecosystem that I just told you about, including Material.io. But I'm not the only one. There's several researchers in material design, and there's 3 buckets of research that we do. So the first is the components, those UI elements. So we do research on those components to make sure that they're useful and usable and accessible. And that research is used both to improve how Google teams use those components in their own products, as well as for external folks like you. And so they make their way into the guidance that's on the website. The second bucket is product research. So anything we're creating for designers and developers, we're getting feedback from folks like you, both early stage to validate the concept, make sure it's a problem worth solving, as well as later stage, the refinement that would be more classic usability. But my favorite place to play is the final area, which is workflow research. And this is where I get to talk to folks like you and find out what are the problems that you're having in your day-to-day work. Who are your main collaborators, and how are you communicating with them? I know we have an incredible plethora of tools that are at our disposal. And how are you accessing all that stuff? So I've done lots of this kind of research over the last couple years, and what I've done for this talk is gone back through all my decks and all my reports and aggregated the bits that really are focused on how designers and developers work together. So I've pulled them in and created this narrative, and that's what I'm sharing with you today. So over this last couple years, I've done research, I've done interviews with over 100 designers and developers. That's where all this data is coming from. Now, the one area that I haven't really researched is when designers and developers are the same person, which I know is the case for a lot of people. So that's kind of a caveat there. So I want to do a little bit of real-time research with you guys. I'm a researcher, so I'm always asking people questions. So since I have a room full of designers and developers, I can't help myself. So I'd like to see a show of hands for, I'm going to want to know who does just design, primarily design in their work, who does primarily just development, and who does both. So let's see a show of hands for who's a designer. Okay, so I'm guessing like maybe about a half. And who's a developer, pure developer? Okay, I see also about the same amount. And who does both? Who's doing both design and development? Okay, a few of you folks. Okay, good to know. So one of the things I'm excited to hear from you as throughout the conference and in the Q&A as we have time is what particularly resonates with you from what you're hearing today and what doesn't. Because I'm aggregating the patterns, but this is the first time I'm aggregating all this and sharing this with such a broad audience. Okay, so let's dive into first the general patterns that I uncovered in designer and developer collaboration. So the first thing I wanted to do when I was thinking about this talk is, can I create a visual that represents how designers and developers collaborate? So this is my first attempt. And, I think that there's something here that really, made sense to me. You're usually going to be starting with design. You're always going to be ending with development. But I showed this to a colleague, one of the design leads at Material Design. She's like, oh, no. You're missing all the meat of the designer-developer collaboration, that back and forth. So this is my next attempt, which, I thought that this really captured something. And she's like, well, I see where you're going with that, but the problem is there's so many other people involved in the development process, right? You have your PMs and your tech leads and your stakeholders and then, the researchers, right? And then you have, but what about when there's, a small startup where you've got 2 or 3 people doing the role of 10 people? So another colleague had this metaphor of product development as just kind of being a ping pong game where you throw the product back and forth to somebody else who needs to do the next piece of it. So this is the metaphor that I ended up in. All this to say that product development is messy. There's a million ways to do it. And so I get that what I'm sharing with you is, hopefully the larger themes that resonate with you in some way. But there's many, many variations on how this works. So now let's talk about the phases of design and development collaboration. So my first project at Google, or my first big research project where I interviewed designers and developers who work together, I made this UX design workflow journey map. And this journey map, the whole point was like, let's take a really deep look at the entire UX design process and look at kind of, what works, what doesn't, what are the key phases. And then I've got at the bottom, I've taken out the content, but the original is got all the tasks and pain points and tools, and that's where a lot of that really granular insight lives. But I just wanted to kind of show you the high-level perspective here. So the 6 phases are discovery, initial design, iterating on the design, validating, beginning building, and implementation. And within every phase, you've got this kind of goes from the green is the positive moment, and then the red is the negative moment. So I've got a key positive and negative moment from every phase, and those are examples taken from the actual research that we did. So for instance, in the initial design phase, a key negative moment for the designer, this is a kind of a design-centric perspective, is when the developer tells them your initial design concepts that you're probably so excited about, not technically feasible, can't build it. So has anybody here had one of those conversations on either side? Does that resonate? Okay, a few of you. Okay, good to know. So this is where I started seeing the complexity of the design-developer relationship. But what I wanted to do for this talk was really look at just this relationship. What are the phases of designers and developers? So this is what I ended up with. 3 phases. The first phase is initial concepting. So this is really design-driven, and I should also mention that this is probably more for more mature and larger organizations that really have a refined process. But the first phase is, although it's design-driven, developers are usually involved because they have to uncover the feasibility issues, like the one I just shared with you. And then the next phase is handoff, and I know the problem with that word handoff is it implies a moment, but it's really a time period that can be quite broad. So both roles are involved because something is getting ready to be implemented, but the design continues. And this usually it has artifacts involved, so the designer sharing design specifications or even just design screens, just mocks. And then the final phase is implementation, which is developer-driven. The design is officially over, but lots of conversations back and forth as developers uncover constraints. So the problem is, the key problem with designer-developer communication is that at every point where data is exchanged, this is this problem that I call lost in translation. Like that game of telephone where you start with a phrase and then one person repeats it to the next person, repeats it to the next person, and it ends up with something incomprehensible. So designers and developers are bringing really different mental models of how they think about their work. So designers are usually really user-centric. They're really kind of thinking about that user's perspective, or developers are really thinking about this technical stuff. What do I build and how do I make this align, this new feature align with what we've already got? So there's a lot of different perspectives there, and that is hard to relate the complexity of every bit of information as you go from one role to another. So this is my favorite quote around designer-developer collaboration. Everything I did before this was worse, and I don't know what would be better. So this kind of goes to show this is a really, really sticky problem. And when we're talking about collaboration with our colleagues, it can often feel like we don't have anything we can do to make it better. It's just not great. So this is a scene from the movie Lost in Translation, speaking of that theme, where Scarlett Johansson's character is asking Bill Murray's character, does it get easier? And she's talking about life and figuring out what you want to do in life. And he says no. But he just comes kind of joking, and he actually comes back and says, well, yes, it actually does get easier. You figure out what works for you, and you figure out what you want out of life, and it gets better. So that's what I'm proposing to you all, that hopefully with kind of some insight as to processes and some tips for making things better, that wherever you're at with your own designer-developer collaboration relationships, that you'll hear some tips that you can make it better for maybe yourself, but also your team, and maybe even your company. All right, so let's get into the granular meat of designer-developer collaboration, what works and what doesn't. Now, first I want to talk about, as I was working on this talk and I'd created most of it, and I was like, oh, wait a minute. There are 4 big categories that these all fall under. So I wanted to go through those with you before I go through the examples. And then you can kind of think about which one of these impacts me or my company or my relationships. So the first is culture. You've got the company culture, the team culture, and even nationality. And when we think about culture, a lot of that's about leadership and things that we don't necessarily control ourselves. The second is proximity. Are your colleagues remote or co-located? That hugely impacts how you work together. The third is our personal experience. Who are we? What matters to us? What are our skills? What are our passions? What is our history? What baggage are we bringing about our relationships to our work? And then finally, our communication style. Are you an extrovert? Are you an introvert? Are there some tools that you hate using? Are there some tools that you'll only use? So think about those as I go through these examples. So I'm going to give you a couple of specific quotes first and tell you stories, and these are all from the interviews I've conducted, and then I'll kind of go through the high-level list of all the pieces that make a difference. So this UX designer said, ideally I make red lines, but things can still change. Recently I ended up having to make 7 versions of red lines due to getting stakeholder changes late. So this is a story I have heard a lot. And what this really reflects is that there's some cultural issues on this team and some communication style issues at play with managing processes. And one of the kind of themes that came out as I was going through this data is a lot of this is about affects economics. So, this is a really inefficient process that takes a lot of time and is draining a lot of resources on this team when you have this kind of churn. And another thing I've heard a lot is developers talking about wanting red lines and not getting them. And, this is kind of the backstory. This designer was trying to make red lines, but just kind of gave up at some point because it was just going to be wasted time. This Android developer said, a lot of times I don't ask questions because I don't want to interrupt the designer so much. Sometimes I wait a day if I've already asked too many questions. So this is somebody who's pretty early in his career, and there was a lot of insecurity at play here. Hasn't really figured out his own style, and there was definitely a sense of like, maybe I should know stuff that I'm not. But instead, this developer, had never had a conversation with the designers he worked with about what he needed and when he needed it. He just kind of subtly was going in and asking these questions. So there, again, this is kind of an opportunity for a much improved process. So here's the list of when problems occur between designers and developers. First, the company values one role more than another. My favorite story here is about a middleware company where the people who bought the product had very little connection to the people who used it, which were developers. It was like, it might have been a security tool or something. And so the company itself had a very low priority on UX. And that sole UX designer was struggling to get buy-in from the PMs to really give himself the power he needed to improve the UX for that team. So that's a great example when the company culture is valuing one role more. Then there's the time, language, and cultural differences. I talked to a design lead at a large e-commerce company who was trying to figure out how to work with his new remote dev team in India. And this dev team had never worked with a UX team before, so they were totally not used to this really intensive back and forth communication that this UX team based in the US was expecting. So it was taking a lot of time to think about and find relationships where he could start building trust with someone to get what he needed from that team. When there's infrequent and indirect communication, the communication needs to be with the designer and the developer who are doing the building. So this can be a problem in larger companies where you have a lot of hierarchy and those people are not encouraged to work together, or when there's just, there's a remote working and it just hasn't been an issue or hasn't been appropriate or encouraged for them to really be in regular communication. Where there's little respect and understanding between the roles. And I was kind of surprised because I know that there can be tension between the designer-developer relationship, but I've heard very few people who really didn't respect their colleagues. Usually there's a lot of respect, but respect is different than understanding. And if you don't have both respect and understanding, then the respect ends up being a little bit shallow. The design can be under or over-specified. So I've talked to teams where they didn't need design specifications. They'd already kind of worked out their own system. But when the developer wants it and isn't getting it from the designer, maybe the designer is working on their next project, maybe they're in that 6th round of revisions, that's a problem. That's a time drain. And then the other side can happen too. It can be over-specified, where I've heard stories of the developer getting so much design specification data that they just don't even know what to do with it. They don't know what matters. And finally, where the process isn't improved. So we all know that we have to iterate on our products to make them better. And we have to take that same attitude to our relationships with our colleagues. So let's go into what does work. I'm interested in development in general, and I try to make their lives easier. It's mutual. We help each other out. So this design lead worked at a small design and development agency. And this was just like, in my mind, it's my favorite example of really deep communication and effective collaboration. Because she talked about, like, whenever there was a problem with something with the developers, she was so excited to kind of figure out with the developer, what's going on? Tell me what I need to know to help so that we can solve this problem together. And it went both ways, and she felt that same, and a lot of that was the culture of the company, really encouraging these people to respect each other. The company valued both roles very deeply. And what was interesting about this was that this was a small agency, and I have to think this really impacted their bottom line, because they had a very efficient process. After handoff, engineers will grab designers on the fly if they have questions. When an engineer gets a milestone, they call the designer over for feedback. So this was a mid-sized startup, and the design manager was just talking about how everybody worked. So what I love about this is it wasn't just this is how she worked with designers and developers. It was how the whole team worked, like very spontaneous, on the fly. If you need information, you can take my time and let's figure it out together. So now for the list of what improves collaboration. First, the company culture values both roles. Part of that is when both roles are given time for the work. So I've given you a couple stories about when there's this churn with design and iterations. But when one role is consistently not given enough time to do their work, that's really a reflection of company values. When there's ongoing direct communication between the people actually doing the work. So I've given you some stories about that. And part of that is when there's mutual curiosity about the other. And what this really means is it's empathy, really caring and understanding what the other person's constraints are and what's impacting their work. And I'll talk more about empathy in a minute. And finally, where the process is evaluated and improved on. So as I mentioned before, our team, Material Design, has just released a bunch of new stuff at I/O, the developer conference. And so it's been a really fun process since then of the team stepping back and looking at our processes and figuring out how we can improve them going forward. And I'll tell you a story about that in a minute. So we've been living in this world of designers and developers, and we're going to step back a little bit and just talk about best practices for effective teams. So here's a question for you. When you're talking to someone, how often are you already crafting your response to them while they're still talking? I would say for me, especially at work, it probably ranges between 50 and 90% of the time. So this is human nature for us to do this. But what it means is that we're not really deeply listening to someone. So cognitive empathy is a term that is defined by Indy Young, who wrote a really great book that came out a couple of years ago called Practical Empathy. And she's a researcher and a founder. She's been in UX a long time. And so this is about, the book is really focused on understanding your users. But she talks about how we can bring this empathy to our own colleagues. So she defines empathy as purposefully discovering the underlying thoughts that guide someone else's behavior and acknowledging them as valid even if they're different from our own. And that last part is really the key to what empathy is like, I might not agree with you, I might not have the same perspective of you, but I've taken the time to really hear what you're saying and acknowledge it as valid. And that's what you really have to do. And that's what's beautiful about this is a tip to bring to any relationship that you might be struggling with, is just take a step back and really get to know them. So her tip for improving your skills in empathy is to practice listening deeply. So she says, practice listening to people. Shut down your inner voice so you can hear more clearly. Recognize your own emotional reactions before they distract your ability to listen. So we talk a lot about UX, or talk about a lot about empathy in the field of UX. And I think this is a great opportunity for us to bring it to our colleagues as well. My next question is, what separates teams that do great work from those that don't? So, I'm sure you all have a few things in your head that pop up, like, oh, I bet I know what this is. I think it's this. So this was a Google research effort that started in 2012 called Project Aristotle. They looked at 180 teams across Google. They interviewed hundreds of people. And some of the first things that people would think are most likely to make a difference in a great team, like it's got super smart people, it's got a wide range of skills, maybe the team gets along really well and has a lot of fun together, maybe they have a certain decision-making process, decision by consensus, or they looked at all those aspects, and nothing was differentiating the teams. It wasn't until they stumbled across group norms, which are unspoken rules that teams live by, where people on the team who had different perspectives were encouraged to express them. There is okay to make mistakes, and there was room for everybody to talk. That was what was the differentiator. And as they dove into this, they realized there was a term for it. It's called psychological safety. So the researcher Amy Edmondson developed this theory in the 90s and has been working in this area since then. So she defines psychological safety as the belief that it's absolutely okay, in fact, expected, to speak up with concerns, questions, ideas, and even mistakes. So this is another term for this is impression management. And I think we all know that feeling when we've been in a meeting and we've had an idea, or we've thought something wasn't a good idea, and we've kind of thought, should I mention that now? And we haven't. Because we were just a little concerned about what other people were going to think of us. Is this going to fit in with what other people are saying? So that's a psychologically unsafe situation. So her tips for improving psychological safety are: first, frame the work that you're doing not as about execution, but about a learning opportunity. Because when it's about a learning opportunity, people are much more in a mind frame of being able to take risks and learn from mistakes. The second one is acknowledge your own fallibility. Let other people know it's okay to make mistakes because you make mistakes as well. And then finally, model curiosity by speaking up, ask questions, challenge people's ideas. So now I'm going to give you some practical tips from my team members. So as I was working on this talk, I started kind of telling all my teammates, and I was like, well, what's your favorite tip for collaborating with the person, with the person from the other role? So these are not going to be all new because there's some themes that have come up a lot, but I wanted to kind of share these examples. So first of all is foster ongoing conversations, right? I've mentioned that a couple times. But one of the things I really like, the tips for that, is discuss your communication preferences. Let the people you're working with know, do you need a couple hours of downtime every day where you aren't interrupted? Or is it okay to just ping you at any time? Are in-person conversations better for you, or do you rather like to have chats? The second is be explicit about definitions, what you mean. Designers and developers, as I mentioned, you bring really different mental models about your work, and a lot of times by not being super clear about what you're talking about, it leads to confusion that people might not really, they might assume that they know what it is. So one of the designers on our team was an architect before, and he talked about a building where there was at one point the literal floor plan changed, and there was a different design, and he was talking to a contractor who had started working on that, and he said, oh, you saw that there's different floor plans there for that floor, right? And the guy's like, what are you talking about? He had totally missed that even though it was the floor plan was a different size, that it was a different design. So he said, that was when I learned I have to be really explicit with people about what we're talking about. And part of that is sharing artifacts. And improve processes. So one of my colleagues who's a designer, and she designs components, and that's what we're doing is building out the components for all the material theming that I've talked about earlier. So the tricky part is that each component has to then be built on web, iOS, Android, and our new platform, Flutter. So they're trying a new process. What she did is she spent a little bit of time doing some concepting. So she brought an idea to a meeting, and then they had a half-day workshop where everybody was in the room. All the platforms were in the room, figuring out what was going to work for all of them. And she said, they ended up totally destroying my initial concept, but together we all got in a much better place, much faster than we were doing it before. So she's like, this is awesome. We really all got on the same page, and there was just such an incredible energy for everybody having their voice accounted for at the same time. So she said, we're definitely doing more of this in the future. So figure out ways to improve your processes. And then another tip is consider checklists. So the book Checklist Manifesto is an awesome book that talks about how really high-risk industries like airlines and hospitals have been looking at how they can reduce errors through something as simple as a checklist. By investigating where the problems come in, they can then go through and create a checklist to account for that. And error rates go down significantly when something as simple as an effective checklist is in place. So one of the checklists one of my colleagues talked about is he's a designer, and he has a checklist for himself that is the edge cases that he needs to consider when he's designing for something. So I'm going to end with a story about one of my colleagues, a junior developer who the job before he came to Google, he was working at a small design and development agency. And it was very design-driven, so all the development, they were given 2 weeks to build everything, and developers were never consulted in the process, and he kind of noticed, this is pretty ridiculous. So he started building relationships with some of the designers and kind of helping them a little bit, and then started kind of making its way up the leadership change and proposed, let's just try this. Let's try including developers earlier in the process. And guess what? It was so much more effective. The product they were building was better because design or development constraints were included, and everybody loved it. So this became kind of an institutional thing. And I love that this was a story of somebody who was, pretty new to the company, pretty new in his career, but he was able to make this change just by kind of working through the process. And I said to him, what does it really boil down to? What is this about? He said, it's just people talking to people. So that's what I'm going to leave you with, people talking to people. I did want to kind of just go through the things I chatted with you about today. We talked about material design, where we're going, and what we're building, and the research we do. I gave you some general patterns in designer-developer collaboration, and then really specific examples about what works and what doesn't. I talked about cognitive empathy and psychological safety as tools that you can use to improve the relationships with your colleagues, and then gave you some really specific examples from my colleagues on material design. And I also just want to mention that we are recruiting for designers and developers who are interested in participating in research for material design. So there's a special link that if you sign up through here, you're only going to be participating in research for material design. And I have some cards as well. So that's it. Thank you so much for listening. I hope we have a little bit of time for questions. I'd love to hear any questions or thoughts you all have. I don't know if are there microphones for cues? Okay, great. All right, so we've got some people with microphones. So any questions, show of hands? We'll bring a microphone over to you.
Hello.
Hi.
Thank you for the speech. I know that Google has remote developers and designers. I'm not sure about designers, but I heard about developers. Is it true? And how do you manage the collaboration between designers and remote designers and remote developers, if you have such?
Well, our team, Material Design, has offices in San Francisco, Mountain View, New York, and I don't know, is there any other offices? Those are kind of where the main offices are. Is that what you mean, where you might have a developer working in one? Well, a lot of the video conferencing. That's really how a lot of video conferencing and a lot of chats.
Oh, okay. And do you use some tools? What products do you use to collaborate? I mean, design tools or maybe something like this.
Yeah. So let me make sure I've got this right. You just want to know what are the tools that Google designers and developers are using in their collaboration. Well, I mean, the big thing are the video conferencing and the chat. And Google is a little bit of a different animal because we have a very limited pool of tools, right? We have super high security constraints. So we are using our own products. So that's great because we're, everything that's out there externally, we've been testing for years usually. So yeah, a lot of chat. But that's where people need to kind of share their preferences. So some people like to have in-person conversations, so they might have a check-in every day. Some teams do, kind of daily stand-ups, or they're checking in and kind of uncovering issues that way. Other teams are just kind of leaving it to people to ask the questions as they need them. So it's probably some combination of regular ongoing meetings and informal communication.
Okay, got it. Thank you.
Yeah?
Hello. Yeah, thanks for your talk. What about the design sprint, using design sprint to solve these problems where people can, developer, designers, stakeholders, sit together for 4 or 5 days, facing the problem from the customer sides and then building a solution and, giving their own input right away. And what about this design sprint come into this, idea to solve these kind of problems?
So let me make sure I've got this right. You're saying that can you use design sprints for solving communication problems or just for the whole design process?
Whole design process.
Yeah. That's a great question. And yes, definitely design sprints, which I'm sure most of you or many of you know that design sprints are kind of a Google developed week-long process for solving big problems. And our team does a lot of sprints, both with external partners who are figuring out how to implement material design and update their design systems, as well as internal Google teams to figure out how to, kind of move their products forward. But that's a great point. I mean, usually design sprints are used to improve the design, not necessarily the communication process. But one of the things that makes those sprints so effective is they have all those key decision makers in the room. And that's one of the ground rules of a sprint is like, if you're a decision maker, you need to be in this room the whole time. And I will say that's one of the real insights that surprised me when I started doing this research is what a difference it makes to talk face-to-face or directly. Maybe it's over video conference. But, with all these remote tools that we have, there's just something about having an actual conversation with someone that makes getting the really granular details right so much easier. So I think that's a great point. I like the idea of figuring out communication process, but the sprint itself is its own communication process. Yeah, so I think that's a great idea. I'm going to have to take that back.
Can you talk about processes and checklists that Google has in place for when you're taking UX at scale? Google is a big company, assuming you guys are doing UX at scale. I mean, for small companies, it's easy to, work on a product and then maybe 2 products, maybe 4 products together. But when the designers and developer team grows to like hundreds and 500s, how do you bring, just from a UX perspective, how do you bring processes in place so that, we of course have UX, UI guidelines, but they're going to follow it, but then we also want to make sure that the end result from the experience point of view is consistent, or at least at the level that the company is expecting.
Let me make sure I've got your question that you just, what is the process at Google for scaling up a product? Yeah, that's a great question and probably not one that I am going to be the right person to answer because there's a lot of complexity there. And I know that, the developer, there's like lots of layers of code base and around security with Google products. So my thought is that, this is what I hear the stories of like, okay, now we got to do this piece of it. So that's a great question. I don't know if there's a specific checklist in place, but I know that every tool is a little bit different. Every product is a little different. We have consumer-facing products or internal products, and then we have professional products like cloud. So I'm assuming probably every kind of team ends up having to create their own process. So my guess is that that's really more of a kind of a team process that has to align with whatever the kind of the hierarchy of processes are with the larger Google infrastructure. So, but yes, that's my attempt at answering that question, but yeah. All right, well, thank you all so much. It was really such a pleasure to be able to kick off the conference.